and ignite significant passions in people. So we remind everyone to please be respectful, and that anyone who cannot adhere to these rules or who is disrespectful or raises topics not relevant to the subject of tonight's forum will be immediately removed from the program. So it is now my privilege to welcome New York State Senator Kevin Thomas, who proudly serves our communities by protecting the health and safety of children and families through his role as state senator and a member of the Long Island New York State Senate delegation. Senator Thomas will help begin our conversation this evening by asking several questions that were received in advance from residents. Welcome, Senator Thomas.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shah. Good evening to everyone, and good to see all the doctors here again. I had a similar forum with these amazing doctors just a couple of months back, and I'm glad we're doing this again. To those who do not know me, I am Senator Kevin Thomas, and I represent District 6 here in Nassau County. First, I would like to thank the American Academy of Pediatrics, Dr. Meltzer-Krief, Dr. Krylov, Dr. Nachman, Dr. Nolan, Dr. Shah, and Dr. Rubin for being here tonight and sharing your knowledge and professionalism and experience with us like you did previously during my town hall. Widespread vaccination is a critical tool to keep our families safe and healthy. We are seeing major progress being made against COVID-19 here in Nassau County. 73.6% of adult residents have received at least one COVID-19 vaccine dose. The recent expansion of vaccine eligibility for preteens and teens will protect their health and the health of our most medically vulnerable residents. This will also help our children safely get back to the things they love: in-person classes, summer camp, and other activities. Thank you to Senator Gaughran, Senator Kaplan, Legislator Drucker for their partnership in making this event possible. I'm looking forward to tonight's panel, and I'll start off with a couple of questions from Nassau residents. The first question goes to Dr. Krylov. How effective is the Pfizer vaccine in children between 12 to 15 years old?
Thank you, Senator Thomas and other distinguished members of the legislature for working to get this information to your constituents and the public, and for enabling us to share what we can this evening. And to my distinguished colleagues on the panel, a pleasure to see everybody again as well. So to answer your question, the data from the trial with the Pfizer vaccine in 12 to 15-year-olds, although a smaller number than in the study that led to approval for adults, shows equal or even potentially better efficacy for the Pfizer vaccine based on the fact that the 1,200 recipients of vaccine, there were 0 cases detected over time of follow-up versus 16 in the placebo group. Furthermore, in the small number who had immunity checked on blood testing, had high levels comparable or greater to adults. 12 to 15-year-olds are actually at their peak function immunologically, so that's not surprising. And for the reasons you mentioned, an important group to be able to offer this important protective step too. So from an efficacy point of view, everything really looks good. From a side effect point of view, similar or less than the side effects in adults, mostly local pain and some fatigue for a day or two after. So a very promising outcome.
Thank you, Doctor. Let me go to Dr. Nachman now. Got another question here. One of the biggest worries parents have is whether the vaccine is safe for their children. Is the vaccine safe for children 12 to 15 years old, and how do we know that?
You're muted, Sharon.
Got it. Sorry. The vaccine safety was compared to the safety in the adult studies. So we looked for the exact same signals a few days after vaccine, a month of vaccine, 2 months. In order for something to get an EUA approval, we need to know that 2 doses went into the arms and that 2 months after dose 2, everybody was followed for safety. Kids were not lost to follow-up or didn't come back or didn't have blood draws. All of that was almost 100% followed in the clinical trial. So we didn't lose kids or they didn't be lost to follow-up. So safety signals were exactly the same as we saw in adults. They had some sore arms, some fatigue, some low-grade fevers, but in fact, they bounced back. If you're asking me, do we have 6 months or 12 months of a track record of safety? Of course we don't. This is a new vaccine. On the other hand, we have to weigh that against the over 100 million people that were dosed with both the Pfizer Moderna vaccines across the US. And in fact, the longer follow-up on those adults with the exact same short-term safety signals was no different. So we were not seeing long-term safety in the adults who got the vaccine with the same safety profile up front. So we do not expect to see any long-term safety signal in the children.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. Next question goes to Dr. Krief. I've heard, again, concerns from adults about the COVID vaccine and infertility. Should women be worried about this?
Hi, Senator Thomas. So there's no evidence to suggest that the mRNA vaccines, or any vaccine for that matter, affect fertility. It's funny, but as pediatricians, when a new vaccine comes out, we kind of always get that question, and there's really no scientific reason to really understand how that would even be possible. But so the vaccine could not be, tested, trialed in pregnant women. We just don't do that. But perchance, 23 women actually did get pregnant during the trials, half of them in the placebo and half of in the vaccine. Mm-hmm. And there was no evidence to suggest that there was any they got pregnant, right? So there was no effect on fertility. And since then, 35,000 women have received the vaccine while pregnant. Now, we don't just give the vaccine and hope for the best when pregnant women start taking the vaccine. There's something called DART studies, developmental reproductive toxicity studies in animals before the vaccine can be given to women. And all those showed no effects on the ability to get pregnant or the safety of the pregnancy and on the fetus development. So there's just no reason to believe that that there's going to be any effect on pregnancy or fertility.
Thank you for clearing up those misconceptions. I yield my time to Dr. Shah.
Thank you, Senator Thomas. I'm honored to welcome Nassau County Legislator Artie Drucker, who's been a passionate advocate for child health right here in Nassau County and a frequent partner with us on issues related to children. Legislator Drucker.
Thank you, Shettle. And I think I can call you Shettle because I do know you long enough that I don't have to refer to you as doctor. But I want to thank you for moderating tonight. I want to thank this very, very impressive group of panelists who are renowned experts in the field of pediatrics and infectious diseases and are known all over this region. Many of us have seen you on TV, in the newspapers, lending your expertise as a tremendous resource to all of us during this pandemic. So I'm honored to have you here at this event and sharing your knowledge and answering questions. We as electeds, all we try to do is to provide our constituents with information, accurate information. And we're so grateful to have you as a resource to all of us. So I thank you again. I want to thank my colleagues in government, Jim Goran, Kevin Thomas, Anna Kaplan. I want to thank you all for joining as well. So I have a couple of questions that residents raised with me. I'd like to share them with some of you as well. My first question is to Dr. Rubin. My child already had COVID. Does he need the vaccine? And isn't he or she already protected?
Well, I want to thank everyone for the invitation and happy to be part of this. That's an excellent question. So that the majority of people that have had COVID do develop antibodies and do develop some level of immunity. However, this is a variable in terms of it occurring and how long it may last. There's a sort of a rule of thumb that you're probably protected against another infection for 90 days after your original COVID infection. In terms of the information we've just heard about the vaccine, the vaccines have been studied to look at neutralizing antibody and look at actual protective efficacy. So preventing a new case of disease. So in this case, I would very much endorse getting the vaccine in terms of reliably getting immunity to further to a repeat infection. Although a proportion of patients who got COVID will have protection for a period of time. The vaccine will give more reliably protective immunity and may well last for a longer period of time.
Yeah,
Thank
hi,
you,
this
Dr.
is Shettle.
Rubin.
I just want to jump in quickly
Next
before we
question.
move to the next question, because this is extremely important, given that we've had up to 4 million children now who've been infected with COVID. The Center for Disease Control actually has a specific guidance addressing this exact issue. And it just builds on what Dr. Rubin was talking about, which is that given the variability of the immune response and the uncertainty regarding how much immunity is required, that people who have still had the disease are still candidates and should be immunized.
And Shittle, if I may, to amplify, I think we've thought children have been a smaller part of this epidemic. And certainly a year ago, only about 3% of cases were seen in children. But now as we look, in part because a lot of the senior and high risk older population have either had disease or vaccine, hopefully, and protected, we heard 76% in Nassau County, 24% of cases are occurring in children. And so it takes an added importance to provide protection for children.
Thank you. That's a perfect segue to my next question of Dr. Nolan. Dr. Nolan, in addition to a medical doctorate, you also hold a master's degree in clinical epidemiology. The original studies of the Pfizer vaccine involved 43,000 people, but the trials in kids, only about 2,200 kids. Is that enough?
Yeah, so, we have, from the original trial, we have a tremendous amount of safety data. And the large numbers there are looking for some rare safety signals. And now, in the worldwide, 1.6 billion doses of vaccine have been given. So there's a tremendous amount of data out there. For the smaller, for the children, the smaller sample size was feasible because we do know sort of risks of severe disease with COVID, and essentially for this vaccine, what we're looking for is the ability to protect and not have a similar incidence of severity with as we do with the COVID. So for the multisystem inflammatory syndrome, as of now, there's about which is probably one of the more severe, other than severe COVID pneumonia, one of the more severe manifestations we've seen in children. And based on the CDC reported numbers, those cases at face value are about 1 in 1,000 of the reported cases. And so, the vaccine was given to about 1,100 children in the trial, and we didn't see any cases of that. So, we are dealing in a very special circumstance here because this is a pandemic, and children have a very high risk of acquiring this illness and this virus, and we do know that we've seen a lot of severe outcomes, and as was just mentioned, we're seeing adults being more and more protected, and children making up a much greater percentage of illnesses due to COVID.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nolan. My last question is for my friend, Dr. Krief. Eve, nice to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. Eve, as a general pediatrician, you give vaccines each and every day to children. My child is due for several vaccines, can they get the COVID shot at the same time as the others? Or do they have to be spread out?
So they can. The CDC actually just came out last week to let us know that we can actually give the vaccines together. And that was really welcome news to pediatricians because with that 2-week delay that they were initially it had in place, just out of abundance of caution, just to be able to look at those side effects more closely. We know as pediatricians, we give multiple vaccines together all the time, and we know that it has absolutely no effect on their safety or efficacy. So it's really welcome news because we know that a lot of children are behind on their vaccines right now. So to be able to have implemented that timing of waiting 2 weeks and balancing that with vaccines that they're already behind on, particularly adolescents who are behind on their meningitis and their tetanus pertussis vaccine, the Tdap, it was really welcome news to know that we can give them together or at any time in the 2 weeks before or after getting the COVID vaccine. So we'll be able to catch up our kids that have that are behind in their vaccines already, knowing that we can give them together now. And we know again for years that it's safe to do that.
Thank you.
I think it's particularly poignant that this is happening at this time, right? Because when we think about the fact that we're transitioning towards the end of the school year, for people who are really interested in getting vaccinated and making sure that they get both vaccines in and then have the requisite potential 2 weeks before they have full immunity, this allows us to catch them up on their regularly scheduled vaccines, but then still potentially get fully immunized and be completely protected prior to summer activities that might pose a different risk, things like camp or other opportunities. So I think that that's a really real, we want to emphasize that really is a game changer in terms of our ability to catch up children and simultaneously protect them from COVID.
Thank you. I now turn it back to you, Shettle.
Thank you, Legislator Drucker. Our next facilitator is really an unwavering champion for children. To ask the next set of questions that were previously submitted is Senator Anna Kaplan. Senator Kaplan.
Thank you. Thank you so much for hosting this really very important event. One of the questions that I do get is that parents who say to me, my child has had bad reaction to vaccines, like hives. Should I still consider giving the COVID vaccine? Should she be pre-medicated or something prior to getting this vaccine?
That question is directed to Dr. Nachman, I believe.
Yes.
So we've had a huge amount of experience asking adults the exact same questions. Do you have any allergies? What were the allergies that you had when you had them? Was it an antibiotic or food? Did you have hives? Did you have respiratory problems? We successfully asked those questions and then vaccinated them and then watched those adults for either 15 minutes or 30 minutes. And the end result is that for very, very, very few people, getting a vaccine did not result in any hives or respiratory distress, and there was no need to pre-medicate. The exception is those very few people that have an allergy to something called Miralax, which we use for kids with constipation or adults with constipation, and some very, very few adults that have particular reactions to intravenous antibiotics. Aside from those, everyone else can be successfully vaccinated, does not need to be pre-medicated. Sometimes we do want to watch them for 15 or 30 minutes. And if a parent is very concerned, number one, they should definitely speak to their child's physician. More importantly, if they're going to get a vaccine, they should arrange to get the vaccine at a place that does have EMT coverage. So if there is any kind of difficulty, there are trained personnel right there and then that can give Benadryl, that can give Epi if it's needed, or any other medications. So I would tell parents, we'd prefer for you not to vaccinate, not to pre-medicate, to get your vaccine, speak to your child's pediatrician, and think about where you're getting vaccinated because that may help settle your fears.
Thank you, Dr. Nachman. I really appreciate it. I think that really does make a lot of sense, and I hope that a lot of our parents take that into consideration. Along the lines of potential vaccine reactions, Dr. Rubin, is it true that the second dose of the vaccine is worse in terms of side effects? If so, what steps can I take to reduce the fatigue and other side effects in my child?
Sure. In both the clinical trials and our experience giving a lot of doses of vaccine, there is a somewhat higher number of side effects after the second dose. I want to emphasize that these are self-limited. They get better after a day or two. There may be local effects such as a sore arm or redness of the arm. There may be systemic effects, a bit of fatigue, mostly low-grade fever. So that even though it's a little more frequent with the second dose, it's not a night and day thing from first dose to second dose. Both doses are very well tolerated. In terms of prevention of those effects, the question often comes up, well, if the child may develop a fever, should I give him a dose of Tylenol, acetaminophen, or Motrin, ibuprofen before vaccination? And we recommend against doing that. There is some data with some other childhood vaccines that giving such medicines with the actual vaccine can actually blunt the body's response, the immune response to the vaccine. We don't know that that's the case for these COVID vaccines, but I would, in general, recommend not giving that. But certainly, if 4 hours later, 6 hours later, 12 hours later, or even the next day, the child develops a fever or has muscle discomfort, certainly any of those medications can be prescribed at that time. And it's certainly our experience that they're very, very effective in making the individual feel better.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin. So very similar to really adults getting the same vaccines.
That's right. I mean, the data that we have in children in terms of those adverse effects, both the types and the frequency, is pretty similar to adults.
Thank you. Dr. Nolan, I understand the vaccine was licensed under emergency use for adults since it was such a big problem. But this was so few kids dying or hospitalized from COVID. Are we better off waiting for full FDA approval, or should we go ahead and actually give the vaccination to our children?
So, relatively few children have died when you compare that to the adult numbers. That's true. But there still have been under 17, over 500 pediatric deaths reported in this country alone. And in the sort of older 17 to 22-year-old age group, there's over 2,000 deaths. If you're the parent of one of those children, that's an extremely, significant issue. The multisystem inflammatory syndrome that we have seen in children as well has been fairly devastating. Not as many deaths, but we have many children who have had strokes in association with that and have, severe, many children have recovered and done okay, but we've also had many children who've had pretty severe outcomes with that. And those are the kids that I see in the hospital. So 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago when that was announced and New York made it available, that day I took my 12-year-old right in to the county center to get her vaccine. So, yes, relatively speaking, it is not as big a problem as we've seen in older adults who, as far as a death toll. We're still really looking into, especially for adolescents, the post-COVID syndrome, and many people are reporting symptoms of what we're calling sort of long-haul COVID and post-acute SARS coronavirus syndrome. And so we don't know what sort of long-term issues we're going to see in many of these adolescents. Many kids who've had very mild symptoms have complaints of, fatigue for prolonged periods, headaches, joint pain, sort of all these very, kind of non-specific symptoms, but can be fairly debilitating. And so, there's, I think, lots of reasons to get the vaccine. In adults, we've now given, with the different varieties of vaccines out there, 1.6 billion doses, more than 1.6 billion doses worldwide. Recorded on, the Johns Hopkins site, there's over 160 million cases of COVID reported, and, over 3.5 million deaths. So with tenfold, more vaccine doses administered, maybe a handful of deaths in some really bizarre and rare sort of syndromes. So to me, the evidence definitely absolutely points in favor of getting the vaccine for our children as well as adults.
Thank you.
Hi, I think that one of the things Dr. Nolan said, I really want to pick up on, because at least in the pediatric literature, one of the things that's been really shown is that one of the strongest things that pediatricians can do when they recommend a vaccine, really any vaccine, is talk about the fact that their own children are immunized, right? The fact that we would never, ever subject our own children to anything that we thought clearly didn't favor vaccination. So I think it is important that we do talk about pediatricians are lining up, and we're overjoyed to be able to get their children vaccinated. I myself got my 12 to 15-year-old children both vaccinated really within 48 hours of when the emergency use authorization was expanded. But I also think it's important to follow up a little bit on the thread of what Dr. Nolan said, because one of the questions in the chat said specifically, I think, addressed this concern, which is, why should my children get vaccinated if kids don't get so sick from COVID to begin with? And I think that it's not just talking about, we're immunizing children because we want to prevent adult spread. We're really talking, as Dr. Krylov had mentioned, the fact that now 1 out of every 5 new cases of COVID is actually occurring in 1 out of every 4 is occurring in children. And to date, 4 million kids have been infected, just 40,000 last week. And if you look at the multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, we really are talking about a potentially devastating disease. And I think what I find most concerning about that is the fact that we don't really know which children right now who get COVID are more likely to develop that disease. We're not entirely sure who is going to be able to get that disease. So we can't really say that, okay, one child is more or less at risk. So thank you so much, Senator Kaplan. It's now my privilege to welcome a longtime legislator and leader and advocate, New York State Senator Jim Goran, who will ask the next few questions. And then we'll open it up to all of our panelists, because I've been logging the questions that have been coming in through the chat and through the question and answer. And we'll use our rest of the time that way. Senator Goran.
Thank you so much, Shuttle. And it's such an honor to be here with so many distinguished doctors and to thank you, because you folks have all been on the front line in dealing with this from day one, both in testing and now vaccinations, and I know, and also dealing with your patients and helping everybody get through this very difficult period. And of course, it's also so great to be here with my government colleagues, Senator Kaplan, Senator Thomas, and County Legislator Arnie Drucker. And while she's here in her capacity as a doctor, I do have to also welcome Dr. Eve-Krief to the elected official club as a newly elected member of her school board. And thank you once again for doing even more to give back to the community. And so my questions, the first 2 are for Dr. Krylov. How do we know the vaccine won't have long-term side effects related to rapid growth that kids have during that period between 12 and 15 when they are really growing pretty quickly?
So, although a new vaccine, and one can argue we don't have the long-term follow-up, there's no reason from how the vaccine acts, how it produces and helps the host produce antibodies against the spike protein. Just as Dr. Krief mentioned earlier, there's no plausible reason to think it would have an impact on fertility. Similarly, there is no mechanism to think it would interfere with growth in any way or get into bones or growth plates. So again, we always, and part of the reason the 12 to 15-year-olds come after the adults is we do want to be extra careful with things we do for children, but we also have to balance not creating unnecessary fears that inhibit us from doing the best thing to protect our children. And so when we look at the realities of COVID, as we've heard, protection is clearly in order. And I can only say that you can never say never, but there's no reason to expect this would have any impact on growth, as none of the vaccines have impacted growth in a negative way that we've been using for generations.
It sounds like you have a high level of confidence. So
I do.
that's terrific. And the next question, will the COVID-19 vaccine be free for children?
As of now, as for everybody else, yes.
Okay. And now I guess this is for all panelists, and I think we're sort of delving a little bit out of the medical field to the extent that we're asking you for opinions on policy moving forward. So for anyone, do you foresee a requirement for the COVID vaccine for school or school-related activities such as sports? And I can tell you, we get lots of questions on our offices, you know, about issues like this. Who would like to answer that?
So I wanted to say right now, while the vaccine is not FDA approved, it's only EUA approved, there's probably a lot of difficulty for us to mandate that it be used for all kids attending school. However, once something is FDA approved and we've had the intense scrutiny that the FDA does, in order to license something for approval, I think it needs to be considered. For those kids who are going out of school, either be on sports teams or debate teams or any other travel outside of the school building, they are going to be seeing lots of other people. And it will be important for us to protect those kids by vaccinating them. So I think there is sort of a halfway mark for September. That for kids that are going to be just sitting in the building, not going out, not doing anything, it's going to be difficult for us to mandate that those kids get vaccinated. But for any kid that's on a sports team, that's going to be interacting with other kids that we actually don't know who they are, what they are, or their vaccine status, we need to protect the kids in our school buildings. And for those kids, I think we are going to strongly urge that they get vaccinated, just like we've asked that the Mets and the Yankees and all of the other sports teams get vaccinated, protect themselves and their teammates.
So to follow up a little bit, I agree with what Sharon said. I think it's an interesting question. There's certainly a long history of approval and mandating of vaccines, going back to smallpox in 1907 and Jacobson versus the state of Massachusetts, where for public health reasons, vaccine was supported. And we went through the 50s and 60s with all the things we do require for schools. And it somehow has been turned into a negative argument. To me, it should be, is it the right thing to do? Are we protecting our children and our society? And the answer to that to me is clearly yes, unless this virus is going to disappear, which I don't think the pundits are prognosticating. So we do what we have to better than when we do what we should. But I think that the issue of mandate should be, why the mandate? Because it's the right thing to do. And so when, as Sharon said, we get to the point that it's approved and we have that full support behind us, I think we should be looking at that in a very serious way. We see private organizations, colleges, including SUNY, are going to require vaccination for in-person attendance in the fall. We went through the same thing at our hospital system. A number of voices wanted to mandate it now, but it was felt because of the EUA that it's going to wait for the approval. And I'm sure a lot of employers are going to, for the good of their employees, the same way for the good of the students, mandate it, not because we're trying to coerce people, but we're trying to help.
All right, thank you so much, Senator Gaughran, and to all of the elected officials who've joined us this evening. We're now just going to open up a little bit to some of the questions that have been coming in through the chat and through all the different sort of means by which people can submit their questions. So I'm going to direct this next question to Dr. Rubin. Dr. Rubin, how long does immunity from COVID vaccination last, and is that different in children than it is in adults?
Yeah, by the nature of the development of the vaccine and the studies of the vaccine that are so recent, we really don't know how long it'll last. If I'm guessing how long, it may last longer in children than adults, only because the neutralizing antibody titers, which is the gold standard of the blood test to help decide how protective the vaccine may be, are higher in children. I think we have good data, at least in adults, that the vaccine lasts for 6 months. How long beyond that, we just don't have the data to know yet. So that's inherently not knowable for sure right at the moment.
And then the next question is for Dr. Nolan. Dr. Nolan, and there's sort of two questions that are sort of, I think, run together. The first is there any required screening my child should get before getting the vaccine in children? I'm going to assume that question means medical screening. And sort of, I think that part of that question reflects another question, which is that how many children with pre-existing respiratory conditions were enrolled in the trials? And should I be concerned if my child has a pre-existing condition in terms of getting vaccinated?
So as far as the first question, as far as screening goes, there are standard questions we ask before administering the vaccine, and they are, the main one is, the main contraindication to the vaccine is if someone has had a prior anaphylactic reaction to a component of the vaccine. And really for the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, and Pfizer's the only one available for the children right now, it's polyethylene glycol. And that's a component that we see in injectable drugs. So if your child has been in the hospital and had an injectable drug at some point, and they had an anaphylactic reaction to that, that's really the only specific contraindication. We have, and that's because we've seen some anaphylaxis in adults, and now that we've been screening for that, we really haven't seen that as much. They do ask other questions prior to receiving the vaccination, as far as, are you immune suppressed, and do you have a bleeding disorder, those sorts of things, and that's really to provide some counseling. If you're immune suppressed, you might not have as good a reaction, or taking any kind of immune suppressive drugs, you might not have as good of an immune response to the vaccine. So those are people who may want to still consider wearing a mask in situations and those kinds of things. And as far as bleeding disorder, you may have more bleeding at the site, that kind of thing. If you're more prone to bleeding and bruising and those kinds of things, and you just need to hold pressure after administering the vaccine. But there's very little that's come up as far as a significant concern. As far as, I don't know, I'm not sure if anybody knows if there was an exact number of kids with pre-existing. Sharon, I know you know the trial data really well. Sorry, I didn't know that right off the top of my head. As far as, asthmatics being enrolled or any kids with underlying chronic lung disease.
So in fact, the clinical trials for Pfizer as well as the Moderna for the 12 and ups actually allowed children with asthma, including children with cystic fibrosis, on the clinical trials. So they did not exclude children with any kind of respiratory component. And when they looked at the subgroup analysis, those kids did as well as any of the kids who did not have underlying respiratory illness. So there was no exclusion for them. They were included in the trial. And when they were analyzed in subgroup looks, they looked just the same, no different. And therefore, we don't expect that the kids who have underlying respiratory issues should be in any way exempt. They can get the vaccine, and they should be treated no differently than any kid who does not have a respiratory issue.
And we do know respiratory issues, put people at risk for more severe COVID disease. So, those are definitely people we want to protect.
Yeah, just one quick thing. I think that Dr. Nolan's point is extremely important, right? We're talking about the risks versus the benefits. And certainly if you have underlying respiratory disease, we do know that the risk-benefit equation is probably more tilted in favor of vaccination because you are at higher risk of hospitalization. I also want to point out, and this is a question for Dr. Krief, which is, if parents really do have concern, I really do want to direct them specifically, if they have a question about their specific child, to their own general general pediatrician. So just Dr. Krief, could you just comment on the general pediatrician sort of as the resource for some of these sort of very individual and tailored questions?
Yeah, I mean, your pediatrician is always there to answer any, specific questions or concerns you have about the vaccine, about your child's specific conditions. I've had parents ask if they need to stop their inhaled steroid, before getting the vaccine. There's a lot, and they don't. There's just lots of individual questions based on your child, and we're always there and happy to answer them. The most common question that I get is concern because the vaccine was developed so quickly, and what about long-term effects, right? How do we know about long-term effects? And that really is the most common question I hear. And the fact of the matter is that there's never been a vaccine that's had to be pulled years or decades after it's been licensed. And there's no reason to think that it will be any different with this vaccine. It went through all the same phases of trial that any other vaccine goes to, all the same rigorous, study. There's never in the history of vaccines been a vaccine that's been followed so closely for safety, because in addition to the normal follow-up that we have, there's been something called active reporting, where we actually reach out to patients and ask them to report if they're developing symptoms. So it's really being very, very, very closely studied. But again, it went through the same phases of study that any other vaccine has gone through, and there's no reason to think that that it would have long-term effects. It works the same way essentially that any other vaccine does, that by the same concept. And it was developed so quickly. I always tell patients that because we're so lucky to live in a very scientifically advanced time right now, that things were able to come together so quickly to be able to make that possible. And we're able to garner those benefits. So we should be grateful that we have this vaccine to protect us.
I guess I just wanted to add one thing. When we think about how quickly a vaccine was first tested in children until it was moved out, either EUA approved or FDA approved, often it's because it took a very long time for that particular study to enroll children on the clinical trial. And when I think about the COVID vaccines, and I look at the adult vaccines as well as the adolescent vaccines, the enrollment was incredibly rapid. We enroll patients, probably hundreds of patients every day across the country, so that within a month of the trial opening, all 2,000 children were actually enrolled. Other studies that involve children enrollments often dragged over time. So the perception was, oh, it took such a long time for this vaccine to get approved. But in fact, it's because enrolling the children on that trial took a long time, not because the analysis did. So one of the things that happened so quickly with COVID was because adults enrolled incredibly rapidly in the study. Most of the adult studies enrolled within 1 month to 6 weeks, and the pediatric trial enrolled within 4 weeks. So it's not that it was any different than any of the prior vaccine studies, except with the intense interest to put kids on, and that the patients were there and they actually enrolled.
Senator Kaplan has a comment. Senator.
Dr. Shah, I just want to thank you and really this panel for their expertise and for really hosting this so that they could answer a lot of questions and concerns of a lot of parents. I'm looking at Facebook live chat and I see there's a lot of postings in there. I think I urge parents to really listen to the medical background of all these really wonderful people that we have here who can actually talk about the science of vaccine and the safety of it for our children. And of course, definitely go ahead and address your questions to our panel. But if you don't feel comfortable, you could certainly go ahead and ask those questions from your own pediatricians. But it has been proven that vaccines are safe, and we are doing this to protect our children. Again, with my gratitude for hosting this event, and I hope that parents really listen to science, listen to you as the experts, and understand that you yourself as parents have already given this vaccine to your children, and you wouldn't be doing that if you did not think the vaccines were safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Kaplan. I just want to address a general comment, or really a thread of comments that's coming through in the question and answer, which is about the mRNA technology that was used to develop the Pfizer vaccine, and specifically whether the duration of surveillance and testing has been enough. And I think it's important, and I'll start the conversation and then open up to any of our panelists. I think it's important for people to realize that the mRNA technology, like we've said several times, is not specifically new as a technology. And that when we talk about vaccination, it's very rare to have any side effects really beyond 6 months, which is why the surveillance period in the initial trials was 6 months, and that continues to be ongoing. I also think Dr. Krief's point about the sort of thoroughness of the surveillance because of the millions of people who would be getting the vaccine, in terms of not just waiting for passive reporting, that is for people to describe things and for physicians to describe things that were time associated with the vaccine, but actually the V-Safe system, which when I got vaccinated, literally sent me a text message every day for several weeks asking me to record my symptoms. So I think that that's something that has really kind of been woven through some of the comments. And do any of the panelists have any other points they want to make related to that?
Yeah, Shuttle. So, we keep talking about the mRNA technology as being new, but really, the technology of us being able to use it. mRNA is something that our cells use every day. I mean, since the evolution of a cell, messenger RNA has been used. Our bodies use it every day to create every protein that is made. And so, essentially we just sort of harnessed that and we're able to adapt it to producing a vaccine. Messenger RNA is the genetic message that comes from the chromosomes in your body to produce a protein. And so essentially what we did, not me, but what scientists did was, take that genetic code of the spike protein and only the spike protein from the COVID, from the SARS-CoV virus, and put it in a little lipid particle that allows it to gain entry into the cell, and it goes into the cell, and the cell just starts producing like it would use mRNA from anyone, from your own cell, and so it's sort of brilliant. It's just using the body's own mechanism to produce an immune response. And, the vectored adenovirus vaccines that AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson use act very similarly as well, just using a virus that can't replicate. It's defective in replication. It can get into the cell, but then it can't further replicate, so it can't cause disease, but it does incorporate that little piece of the coronavirus protein, the spike protein, which is what we produce an immune response to. So we sort of talk about it as being new, but it's essentially mRNA is ancient. It's as old as eukaryotic cells.
Yeah,
Just
also,
to quickly, go ahead, Dr. Carla.
You're muted, Lenny.
To follow up on that, the other thing of note is that these are turned over rapidly. So once this mRNA gets in the cell, makes the protein, it is broken down in a matter of hours and is gone. So the thought that it's hanging around is a misnomer. And the other question or concern I've heard people raise is, well, it's the nucleic acid. What about DNA? This particle only gets into the cytoplasm of the cell, doesn't get near the nucleus or the DNA. So again, there's no interaction there. So it's a matter of, as Dr. Nolan so nicely put it, understanding the science of it, and that we've had this concept forever. There have also been for years chemotherapy approaches of immunotherapy using this mRNA technology, and actually some earlier vaccine development for things like Zika and influenza using this that just weren't felt to be needed, but didn't come to market. So this isn't the first stab at this technology, and the science predicts it will be safe as well.
I feel like it's also an important point. And then once I make this point, I want to go to Dr. Rubin for the next question. But some people are mentioning that the mRNA technology has had difficulty getting FDA approval in the past. And I don't think that it's the technology, it's the ability to deliver that technology. The lipid nanoparticle is one of the things that is really sort of novel in terms of the delivery system, and that the approval process was as robust and rigorous as it would have been for any other potential vaccine. Now, before we move to the next question, this is a question for Dr. Rubin, but then afterwards is open to all of our panelists. Dr. Rubin, can you comment on reports of heart inflammation, myocarditis, and COVID vaccination in adolescents?
Sure. Very recently, there have been some reports, and again, this is part of the robust system of a vaccine that is put out and become available to find out any potential adverse effects. So if anything happens, that's supposed to be reported. And indeed, there's been some reports of some mild inflammation of the heart in some individuals who've gotten COVID vaccine. And so, unusual things are going to occur in vaccine recipients, and many times that's simply on the basis of chance. So that some of the most common viruses that cause heart inflammation are circulating more because we're not all in our homes all day, given the percentage of vaccination of adults in the community. So that these heart inflammation may be on the basis of chance. It's very important to learn if that is related to the vaccine. And those studies are ongoing, and we should learn that relatively soon. Even if it is related to the vaccine, if it's very rare, then one makes the judgment, just like we do with every vaccine and every medication we prescribe, if the benefit outweighs the risk. And if this is a mild self-limited condition, which it appears to be so far, but it's early days, and it's rare, then in I think most people's estimation, mine included, would be that the benefits of the vaccine, for all the reasons that have been discussed earlier during this seminar, outweigh the risks. So we're still collecting data. There is some reassuring data. For example, in the military, this question of myocarditis after vaccine has been looked at very carefully. And of course, that's a large number of young adults that have been studied. And they have a very robust system for studying myocarditis or inflammation. And they've not seen an association. So they do have some cases of myocarditis in that population, but not associated with the COVID vaccine.
Any of the other, go ahead, Dr. Nachman.
I just want to add one thing, that first of all, the age group that people are talking about is not the 12 to 16-year-olds, but rather 12 to 30-year-olds. So it's a much wider range of who they're seeing some of these reported cases of myocarditis. But more importantly, the FDA has the information, as does ACIP. And as we saw with the J&J vaccine, when there was a concern of an adverse event related to the vaccine, they put the vaccine on hold until all the cases could be evaluated. As of now, the ACIP and the FDA have the data on these rare events of cardiac inflammation or myocarditis, and they have not requested a hold on further vaccines for any of these age groups. That tells me that the cases were less than the events of the J&J vaccine. Perhaps we're vaccinating more, they're seeing them less frequently. And as we've heard from Dr. Rubin, that the outcome was very mild, everybody resolved, there's no one still hospitalized, there's no significant adverse event, deaths, etc. And because of that judgment call, they are not requiring that the vaccine be on hold until further data comes in. They're happy with the data, they have not put it on hold, and they're letting us continue, as of right now, to vaccinate children.
Thank you for that, Dr. Nachman. There's more comments coming in, and obviously there are going to be more questions and we're going to be able to answer. But I want to ask Dr. Krief, because there's a lot of I guess, discussion really going around this question of the speed of vaccine development. And I think that one of the sort of existential hesitations that a lot of people have is just how much faster they perceive this vaccine as being developed compared to the standard vaccines, some of which have been around since the 50s. Dr. Krief?
Yes, again, I always like to tell parents that we should just feel very lucky that we live in a time that it was possible to develop it so quickly. So we already discussed that mRNA technology being around for decades already, right? Also, scientists knew a pandemic was coming. They didn't know when, they knew it would be soon, but they knew it was coming. And they also suspected that the coronavirus would be the cause of that pandemic. So it was a very well-studied virus. And they also knew that this virus attached via the spike protein. So as soon as that virus was identified, they were very, very quickly quickly able to come up with the genomic code, and then use the mRNA technology, which they use so well and which can produce vaccines very quickly, more quickly than other types of vaccines, to produce a vaccine against that spike protein very quickly. So that's one arm of it. The other thing is funding. Normally scientists have a lot of really good ideas, but it takes years and years to get that funding, right? Because particularly with vaccines, pharmaceutical companies make 97% of their profits off of medications, not really from vaccines. They have to invest like $1 billion for a vaccine for research and development. And oftentimes those trials will fail. So it's not really a cost-effective thing for a pharmaceutical company to do, to invest all that money in a vaccine that might ultimately fail. But here we had governments around the world funding these studies with all these scientists around the world working on this one singular, objective. So, funding was a big part of it, and we had it in this case. And that was another big part of it. The other thing Dr. Nachman alluded to, that there were so many participants that volunteered to be in the trials. And also another issue with vaccine trials is that you need to have vaccine virus in the community or bacteria to be able to test whether a vaccine works, right? So here we had so much COVID circulating in the population that it was very, very easy to test to see if the vaccine worked or not. So it was just sort of all those things coming together to help scientists really move this along very, very quickly. And we should be grateful for that, because it saved, ultimately it will save millions of lives, right? But it's just, I feel very grateful. And I as well gave my son the vaccine the day after it became available.
So we're at the top of the hour, so I'm just going to ask the panel in general. First of all, thank you all so much for taking time to participate in this panel and really try and provide strong answers to a lot of these questions, and hopefully begin a conversation that a lot of the people who are attending will continue in the office of their general pediatricians. So this is the last question. It's for the entire panel. And then I'm going to ask Senator Kaplan and Legislator Drucker to give us some closing comments. So there's a question about the dosage in 12 to 15-year-olds compared to adults. Why isn't it smaller?
Yeah, I can take that question. For lots of vaccines, for example, the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, or Prevnar 13, that's given routinely to every infant at 2, 4, 6 months of age, is the same dose it's given to adults. And so it's not a kind of how much liquid is in the shot, or even how much amount of the vaccine is in the shot, but rather it's how the body responds to it, what the immune response is, how much you need to develop an appropriate protective immunity. So that's studied in the clinical trials, and by the precedents from other vaccines, it's not at all surprising that 12 to 15-year-olds have the same dose as adults.
I would echo that, and I think it's part of the reason that it's being done stepwise. Now, as you get down to 2 to 11-year-olds and smaller size and different responses, that may be an issue. So test including a number of doses to see if the same dose or less dose elicit those responses in the safety profile. But 12 to 15-year-olds are sufficiently similar in their responses and immunity.
Unfortunately, it looks like we've overburdened Dr. Karloff. Oh, there he is.
Yeah, bore this out. So I think, I'm sorry, I don't know what happened there. There's some thunder rumbling around, which may affect my connection, but I apologize. But anyway, I think that there's enough reason and similarity, and the safety studies bore out that this dosage and the immune responses are appropriate. For the younger children moving down, dose may need to be an issue. And so for 2 to 11-year-olds, there are several doses being looked at, and why that's the next arm of the study to increase our ability to protect the population.
So again, I want to thank everyone for taking their time. Dr. Karloff, you have to stop playing Fortnite at the same time while you're doing this so your camera doesn't freeze. But I'm going to turn it over to Senator Kaplan and then to Legislator Drucker for some closing comments. Senator Kaplan.
Tisha, I really want to thank you for hosting this event and really trying to get some answers to a lot of parents' concern and questions that they have. I have to tell you, I agree with Dr. Krief. We are blessed to live in a country that we were able to come up and have a vaccine. We all saw what this pandemic did to our nation, to the whole world. And we are beneficiary of the science. And I'm grateful for all the scientists who worked so hard to get this vaccine out so that we can actually get vaccinated, pick ourselves up, and move ahead. I'm one of those who believes in science. I will always believe in science. And I leave this to the experts. And I want to thank each and every one of you who are experts in this for coming on and answering those questions and hopefully encouraging parents to go ahead and give the vaccine to their children and to also really discuss their concerns with their own pediatricians. Thank you again.
Thank you, Senator Kaplan. Legislator Drucker, any parting comments?
Thank you, Shettle. And again, I want to thank all of these very, very distinguished professional doctors on here. And I want to thank Anna Kaplan, my friend, also for being here, and Jim Goran and Kevin Thomas as well. I echo Anna, your sentiments as well. And Dr. Krief's comments. We are blessed to be living in a world today where science can effectuate such progress that we have to really take the opportunity and learn from it. And it's a learning process. It's a day-to-day learning process. And if more people would listen to what we are saying here tonight, what you all are saying tonight, it's so beneficial. And if people will rely upon that, I think it'll make their decision that much easier. Yes, getting vaccinated is a personal decision, but all personal decisions should be founded in fact. And fact here is science. And that's what we should rely upon. And every one of the experts here tonight have, in my opinion, provided us with very reassuring, factual opinion, knowledge, and information that we can rely upon. And I'm hoping that it is beneficial and that we get more and more people vaccinated and we get closer and closer to a herd immunity, and we can put this behind us to some respects anyway. So again, I am grateful for all of you for being such a resource to our community day in and day out, and for being really the true heroes during this pandemic. My blessings to all of you. Thank you.
So I want to thank all of our participants. I want to thank all of those who tuned in via Facebook or through the webinar format. And obviously, again, this is the start of a conversation. We urge you to continue this conversation with your regular pediatrician in your medical home. We thank you so much for attending.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.